Oh, oh, is it? All right.
Sorry about that. We had a technical difficulty. Welcome everyone to our Civil War and Reconstruction MOOC Google Hangout today with Eric Foner, Professor Eric Foner. My name is Andrew Flackard. I'm a project manager here at the Columbia University Center for Teaching and Learning, who bring you this wonderful MOOC every week. Today we will be responding to questions and comments about the course and celebrating the end of the second run of Course 1. To post questions, please open the Q&A panel under the grid in the upper right-hand corner of your Google Hangout screen. We'll also be posting questions that were posted to the course discussion forum that we created for this Google Hangout. And without further ado, Professor Eric Foner.
Thank you, Andrew, and welcome to everybody. I'm very happy to be able to communicate in this high-tech way with some of the people who are taking the MOOC. So without further ado, and I encourage you all to post questions. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can. So without further ado, we will go to the first question. And we're starting, Andrew is posting them up there so I can see them. How much information did people who were enslaved in the South receive about the national political debates over slavery, such as Dred Scott or the Kansas? That's a good question. What did slaves know about the political controversies which were raging in the United States about their status? Of course, it's hard to answer that in great detail, but the fact is we know that slaves had more knowledge than one might think. First of all, they lived among white people who were constantly discussing these questions. They heard their owners discussing them. They heard conversations at the dinner table. They saw political rallies and speeches going on during campaigns. During the secession crisis, there were reports in Southern newspapers that slaves were very cognizant of the crisis and of Lincoln's. They knew Lincoln had been elected. They didn't know the exact platform of the Republican Party, but they knew that white Southerners were very alarmed by Lincoln's election. So, without thinking that they had a tremendously detailed knowledge of politics, it's certainly not the case that they were ignorant either. And, there was what was called sometimes this sort of invisible grapevine, the sort of ways in which slaves communicated with each other without going through their owners or others. So, slaves were part of American society, and they were aware of what was going on in the white world around them. Okay, we'll go to the next question. I'm curious about what you think of MOOCs. All right. Now that this course has been going on for more than a year, what reaction have you received from Columbia administration and other faculty? This is from Kathy. That's a good question. What do I think of MOOCs? I like them. I think the MOOC is a way of, I've taught at Columbia for many, many years. I started here in 1982. I've taught, I don't know, I can't tell you how many hundreds and thousands of students I've taught in the classroom. I could add it all up. But through the MOOC, I can reach a completely different audience, far more people at one time. People of all ages in places far removed from our campus, obviously. And I think it's a great thing. I mean, my job as a teacher, as a scholar, is to try to disseminate what I consider up-to-date knowledge about American history. And the MOOC is a very good way of doing that. It's not exactly the same as teaching in a classroom with students where you're interacting back and forth all the time. But I think it has great potential for what we're doing. I don't know what our administration thinks. I don't talk to them all that often, but many faculty are quite interested in the MOOC and my experience, and they ask me, should I do a MOOC? And I usually say, yeah, you should. However, it's a lot of work. Don't just think you're going to just sit back and in 2 or 3 hours do it. But I think it's worth it. So I have enjoyed doing the MOOC. I enjoy seeing the reactions of people. I enjoy meeting people. I do a lot of lecturing around the country on historical questions, and I frequently meet people who are enrolled in the MOOC, and that's a way of meeting them person to person. But, the MOOC is one form of education. It's not the only form. It's not going to replace all other forms, but it does have a important place now in the dissemination of knowledge about American history and many other things. So I'm very pleased with how it's worked out. Okay. Can you talk a little bit about those whites in the Deep South or even in the Upper South who opposed the secession movement? Did a large number of non-supporters emigrate to the North? Well, that's interesting. What the popular sentiment about secession is open to a lot of debate. We didn't have public opinion polls at that time. Whether they're accurate or not is another question. There were considerable number of whites in almost every state, maybe not South Carolina, who were skeptical or outright opposed to secession. Most of them tended to be non-slaveholders in every state in the Union except South Carolina. A majority of white families did not own slaves. That didn't mean they were anti-slavery, but many of these white farmers in backcountry areas, eastern Tennessee, western North Carolina, western Virginia, were not in favor of secession. Did they move to the North? No, there was no significant movement of people to the North. But as the Civil War went on, and we will see this in the next MOOC, there were areas in the South which had almost an internal civil war between people who supported the Union and people who were Confederates. Every southern state except South Carolina had a unit of white soldiers who fought for the Union in the Civil War, not to mention many tens of thousands of African Americans from the South who fought in the Union Army by the end of the war. So the South was divided. I think the point of this question is correct. There was not one South. There was an Upper South and a Lower South. There were divisions within them. And we will talk a lot more about this when the next MOOC begins in January, at the end of January, and how internal division in the South affected the course of the Civil War. Okay. President Buchanan effectively armed the southern states and allowed them to steal federal monies. Why would he allow this to happen? And then allow Anderson to move to Sumter? And well, what was President Buchanan in the period between Lincoln's election, November 1860, and Lincoln's inauguration, March 4th, 1861, you've got November, December, January, you got 4 months. Buchanan is in office. He's generally considered pro-Southern, and yet he does not recognize secession. The Southerners are pressing him. You've got to say, okay, you guys have seceded. That's your right. The Union is dissolved. He refused to do that. He refused to he said secession is illegal. On the other hand, he was not in any way, he didn't have the desire to use force to combat secession. So he was in a position, what could he do? Yes, it's a good point. But when the southern states seceded, they took with them federal forts, federal property, the federal mint at New Orleans, which contained a lot of money and financed the Confederate government for a good while. Buchanan was not in a position to do anything about that. The regular army was 15, 20,000 people. And there was no, casus belli, there was no incident of war that had taken place. The closest was in January when he sent ships, the Star of the West, to reinforce or to supply Major Anderson down in Fort Sumter. Southerners fired on the ships and they went away. So nothing happened. Buchanan could have said, like Lincoln did, okay, they've started a war, we're fighting, but that's not what he did. I'd say Buchanan's main motivation was to get to the end of his term and hand the government over to Lincoln. He didn't want to be involved in a war. On the other hand, he didn't want to recognize secession. So he played for time. And, what's interesting is when Lincoln delivered his inaugural address, March 4th, 1861. In writing that, he relied heavily on three famous documents. One was Jackson's proclamation against nullification by South Carolina. One was Daniel Webster's reply to Hayne in the Senate around that time, which was a statement of the nationalist view of the nation as opposed to the state sovereignty view. The third one was Buchanan's message to Congress in December 1861, in which he denied the legality of secession. So Lincoln borrowed from his message. So Buchanan was, the irony of Buchanan is he ended up as the head of a sectional Northern government because Southerners in his cabinet left, even though he had long been considered a Northerner with sympathy to the South. So it's a very odd and interesting trajectory that he followed. Okay, let's go to the next one. This is from Nella. No, is that right? Yes, it is. Okay, good. In contemporary historical research on the Civil War, where does the balance lie between establishing so-called truths and developing historical interpretation? Well, that is the $64 question for all studies of history on any subject. We all hope to establish truths, but our concept of truth is not exactly the same as a scientific concept. Nella, I believe, is a scientist from Oxford. I've been in communication with her. Historical truth is not reproducible, you know? When Galileo went up on the Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped 2 cannonballs down to show that gravity affects them the same, I think that's what he did, anybody in the world could reproduce that experiment and it would have exactly the same result. That's a scientific law. History isn't like that. 10 historians looking at the same documentation, the same period, will come up with 10 different accounts. They'll overlap, but they won't be identical. So our concept of truth is sort of the approximation of what happened. It's not truth with a capital T. And it always is linked to historical interpretation. These are not mutually exclusive or contradictory things. The interpretation tells you what's important to study in the first place. So yes, I believe my account is truthful, but I also understand it's my interpretation. And another scholar giving a MOOC on the coming of the Civil War would probably say many of the things that I say, but he would also differ in some respects from me. That doesn't mean I'm right and he's wrong, or I'm wrong and he's right. It means there are many different legitimate ways of viewing historical situations like this and others as well. Okay, let's see now. The journalist Carl Bernstein on CNN today referred to the know-nothings today, the 10th. How can a nation of immigrants be so anti-immigrant at various points in our history? Well, that's a good question. We all know, thanks to the MOOC, what the know-nothings were in the 1850s, a kind of a anti-immigrant, particularly anti-Catholic movement, which rose and then fell very meteorically, very dramatically. This has been a tension in American history throughout our history. In the 1790s, we had the Alien Act, which was directed against foreign immigrants and gave the president the right to pretty much deport anyone he felt like. In the 1840s and 50s, you had a pretty vigorous nativist movement, the Know Nothings part of that, mostly directed at Catholics, Irish Catholics, who it was felt, and there are echoes of, I'm sure Bernstein must have mentioned this today, echoes of this in current debates about Muslims in America. Is Islam compatible with American democracy? I believe it is, but in the 1850s, people were saying the same things about Roman Catholics. Can Roman Catholics really be part of American democracy? Well, we know they can, but in the 1850s, a lot of people thought they couldn't. 1890s, the Immigration Restriction League was pressing for restrictions on the so-called new immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. Jews from the Russian Empire, Poles, Greeks, Slavs, who didn't seem to be quite the same as more traditional Americans. And today, of course, the question of immigration is a hot political issue, and I'm not going to go into our political debates right now. So what can I say? Yes, I'm here in New York City. We have a Statue of Liberty out there in the harbor, which is supposed to welcome the, huddled masses yearning to breathe free. But there's a lot of people who want to close off that door and build a wall and say, no, people of one kind or another cannot come into the United States. This is not new. That's why Bernstein, I assume, was talking about the know-nothings. This has happened at many points in American history. You keep talking about equality and slavery in the mid-19th century. I have just gone through the nativism, here we go again, section of the lectures. Why don't you expand on the issue of Native American Indians during the period? Good question. In the next MOOC, we will talk more about Native Americans during the Civil War. Native Americans occupied a highly unusual situation in the nation at this time. Legally, they were not citizens of the United States. They were citizens of their tribal sovereignties. The nation, the government dealt with them by treaties, right? Many laws of the nation did not apply to them. They had their own tribal laws. In some, on paper, they were equal, but of course they weren't equal. They were subordinate. And by this point, many of them, most of them, have been removed from the part of the country east of the Mississippi River. They've been removed to Oklahoma, to reservations elsewhere. But west of the Mississippi, there were still large areas under Native American control and with very little white population. And the Indian Wars of the Civil War era and the Reconstruction era are yet to come on the Great Plains of the West. So if you want to probe a little deeper, we could say that the whole concept of the westward expansion of slavery or of free labor, both of them, the territorial issue itself is predicated on the removal of the Native Americans, right? There are plenty of Native Americans in Kansas, Nebraska, but both North and South assume their removal. Southerners want slave plantations to go out there. Northerners want small free farmers to go out there, but they're all assuming that land is empty. But it isn't empty. It is going to be emptied of Indians by force, basically, or by treaty or other methods. So the question is quite right. There should be more attention to Native Americans, but the problem is both North and South fundamentally at this point saw Native Americans simply as an obstacle to be pushed aside. And that, of course, with your question, doesn't comport very well with the idea of equality in the United States. So it's a good question. In the next MOOC, there will be more attention to the Native Americans and how the Civil War affected them. Why did the North fight to preserve the Union? That's a great question. Did their belief in manifest destiny mean the South had to be part of the Union? Did they want the wealth of the South? Were they simply authoritarian, didn't like the South challenging them? That's another one of those $64 questions. Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, published here in New York, wrote very famously, "Erring sisters go in peace." He said, look, I don't believe in secession, but go. If that's what you want, go. Go in peace. Very, very few Northerners took that position. Why? It's many of the things you mentioned and many others, but I think there was Lincoln himself, who is very typical of mainstream Northern opinion. Lincoln holds this view that the United States as a nation has a kind of special mission in the world, we hear that today, to promote the idea of democracy in the world. We are a symbol, an example of democracy in a world overrun with monarchy, tyranny, etc. The breakup of the American Union, says Lincoln, would be the destruction of democracy in the world. I mean, that's what the Gettysburg Address is about. The war is about whether democracy will survive in the world or not. Now, Lincoln also realized that slavery is a contradiction. We talk about democracy, but we have 4 million slaves, he says in his great Peoria speech. And to break up the Union would also destroy that mission. So, you know, I think there is a lot of this sense, whether it's exceptionalism, manifest destiny, that the integrity of the American nation is important to the whole world. Now, you know, the wealth of the South, hey, the South has cotton. The North could get that cotton, whether the South is independent or not. Britain was getting all that cotton. The South wasn't part of Britain. I don't think economic motives were that important, because if the South is independent, they'd have to trade. You could deal with them like you deal with other countries. What's the problem? But I think this ideology of nationalism, exceptionalism is very powerful in the North, and does underpin this notion that the integrity of the nation must be maintained. All right, let's go to the next question. To what extent did fugitive slaves or other ex-slaves contribute to the abolitionist movement? Yeah, that's a good question. I wrote a book about fugitive slaves earlier this year, called Gateway to Freedom. Might as well plug it. Fugitive slaves had a very important impact, both individually and, in a sense, as a concept. Individually, you had people like Frederick Douglass, Harriet Jacobs, many others less well known, who became abolitionist speakers, organizers. Some of them wrote what were called fugitive slave narratives, that is, books detailing their experiences in slavery, which became major forms of abolitionist propaganda. But then taking less well-known people, the very actions of fugitive slaves helped to widen the sectional gulf. Running away from slavery was a rebuke to the pro-slavery argument. It kind of showed that the notion of all the slaves being happy, contented, well-treated was not true. It pushed onto the center stage of national politics very divisive issues about what is the obligation of the North to, you know, help to enforce the laws of the South. Why must the North be slave catchers for the South? That question became a very volatile one in the 1850s. So the actions of fugitive slaves forced these issues onto the national agenda. So yes, even though, how many fugitives escaped every year? Nobody really knows, but my estimate is maybe 1,000 a year. From 1830 to 1860, maybe 1,000 slaves a year escaped from the South and got to freedom in Canada, basically. Well, that's 30,000 people. That's cool, right? 30,000 people got out of slavery, but there were 4 million slaves in the United States. The fugitive slaves were not destroying the system of slavery, and yet their actions had ripple effects far broader than the numbers might suggest. I don't think you mentioned in class that John Wilkes Booth witnessed the execution of John Brown. What do you make of this? Nothing. I don't make anything of it. Is it true? I've heard it, but you know, there's a lot of things about John Wilkes Booth which may or may not be true, but let's assume it is true. The execution of John Brown was a big event in Richmond, Virginia, and you know, I don't think that he decided at that moment to assassinate President Lincoln. President Lincoln wasn't president then. Nobody, in fact, when John Brown was assassinated, nobody in their right mind would have thought that Lincoln was going to become the president. So John Wilkes Booth, maybe the point is, John Wilkes Booth was a radical, ideological, pro-Southern, pro-slavery person. And, you know, that's why Booth assassinated Lincoln down the road. Oh, let me just check our microphone here has to be kind of reconfigured. There we go, I think. Let's see if it's on. So a slight technical glitch here, folks. Is it okay?
We're good.
All right, good. All right, anyway, I don't think I wouldn't make too much of it, although it is an interesting coincidence. I agree. Okay, who's next? What federal intervention, if any, was used during the Kansas Civil War? People crossing the border to illegal sway the vote? Well, nothing, no. There was virtually no federal intervention. That was the problem, in a way. There was a civil war going on, and there were some federal troops out there, but they did very little. Nothing was done to stop Missourians from crossing over the border into Kansas in order to vote in Kansas elections. Remember, the Buchanan administration, regardless of what I said before about the secession crisis, was deeply pro-Southern. His cabinet was filled with radical pro-Southern members, and there was no effort to enforce a kind of a equilibrium out there. That was up to the local militia, armed bands. So it was a very chaotic situation in Kansas. And the federal government did very, very little. Oddly enough, at the same time, the federal government was intervening in Utah, the so-called Mormon War, to try to impose more federal authority on Utah, where the Church of Latter-day Saints, the Mormons, was kind of in control of the government of Utah. But then you had a mini war, a little war between the federal government and the Mormon authorities, but not really in Kansas. Do you believe Stephen A. Douglas felt he could not win the election? For somebody not from the U.S., can you explain how you become president with 40% of the vote? Well, we have an odd political system in this country whereby the president, every 4 years, people kind of hear about this. Otherwise, they don't think about it. The president is not elected directly by popular vote, right? Unlike in many countries, that's the case. For example, in Britain, nobody votes for the prime minister. They vote for the party, the candidates of the party, and the party that has a majority in parliament chooses the prime minister. Nobody voted for Cameron directly except in his district, but he's the leader of the Conservative Party. They have a majority, so he's the prime minister. Now in France, there's a direct election for president, right? And actually, I think 40% is you have to win over 40%, or maybe it's 50%. It's a two-tier thing. And then in the first round, there's a lot of people running, and then in the second round, the top two fight it out. Anyway, in this country, we have the Electoral College. You're voting for electors. Each state has a certain number of electors. So when you go to the ballot box and you say, I'm voting for Obama or I'm voting for Romney, you're voting for electors pledged to them. The result of that is that the guy, and it has been guys up to now, but a woman may run or is running and may win in 2016. The guy who gets the most popular votes doesn't necessarily win the electoral vote. That happened in 2000, where Gore had a popular majority, but because of the way the electoral vote is distributed, Bush won a majority of the electoral vote. In other words, you can pile up the votes in a state where you are which you win, but your opponent could win by a small margin in other states. So you have more votes, but he's got more electoral votes. So Lincoln's election proved Lincoln won by winning the entire North. He didn't get a vote in the South. He got 40% of the national vote, and yet that was enough to carry the entire North. He got a majority in all the northern states and nothing in the southern states. So that proved that you could win the election by only carrying the northern states. That's what alarmed the South. Now, did Douglas believe he could win? Of course he believed it. You don't run for president without believing you could win. Douglas had support both North and South, but the problem is he was sort of ground into pieces by the northern candidate, Lincoln, and the southern candidates, Bell and Breckinridge. There was no room anymore for the middle ground, which Douglas was trying to operate. Douglas thought he could win until October. At that time, you had state elections in October and then national elections in November. In the state elections in October, the Republicans swept the North. That showed Douglas, hey, Lincoln's going to win. No, people aren't going to change their vote in 1 month. Lincoln is going to win. He's going to carry the same votes as in October. That's when Douglas realized he was not going to win. And that's when he went to the South to campaign and told them, don't rely on Northern Democrats to support you if you secede from the Union. We will support the Union. It was very courageous of him. But yes, you can win in the United States without winning the popular vote. So it's a weird glitch in our democracy. Do you think the Civil War is a good candidate for historical uncertainty? Do you think modern politics affect the lack of historical consensus at all? Mookie Kinkadell, TA. Does that mean Mookie is posting this question? Mookie, you know the answer to this question, or you're causing trouble. By the way, Mookie's a Canadian. He shouldn't even be asking questions about this. He should worry about what's going on up there. You know, and Mookie is a fine, excellent PhD student. And in his dissertation, I'm sure he will discover that historical uncertainty is always on the table, no matter what. At any moment in history, the future is uncertain, right? After it happens, it becomes certain, right? It becomes inevitable after it happens. What I mean by that is after something happens, the historian can narrate a plausible explanation of why it happened and a narrative of events leading up to what happened. But in 1860, did people know they were living on the eve of the Civil War? No, of course not. We know it, and that gives us an advantage in explaining what was going on. So the Civil War is, of course, a candidate for uncertainty, by which I think you mean, was it inevitable? Did it have to happen? No, of course not. Nothing is ever inevitable. And yet, certainly the Civil War that happened in 1861 was not inevitable. It's possible to imagine some sort of compromise again, but to my mind, some kind of conflict was inevitable. If not then, some other point. I have never seen a plausible scenario for the peaceful abolition of slavery. That's all. If you can show me a way slavery would be abolished peacefully, I'll say conflict was not inevitable, but there was no way. I'm sorry. There was absolutely no way to rid this country of slavery without war, which is a sad commentary, and it led to a terrible loss of life. Anyway, all right, let's go on to the next one. Where are we? You're clicking on what if that one, what if any impact did the events marking the sesquicentennial, the 150th anniversary of war, have on the American people, on Civil War scholarship, etc.? We have just gone through the 150th anniversary of the Civil War. We're now into the 150th anniversary of Reconstruction, the period after the war. But you know, it's interesting. I'm old enough to remember the centennial of the Civil War in the 1960s. That, I think, generated a lot more public interest than the sesquicentennial. Maybe it's because nobody knows what sesquicentennial means anyway. What is a weird word? How do you spell it? I don't know. But also we're 50 years further removed from the Civil War. It's receding into history. I don't think it had that big an impact. There were some events, but not anything that much. I don't think. What about Civil War scholarship? The Civil War scholarship is a giant industry. It will keep plowing ahead like a big battleship or something. I don't know that the sesquicentennial affected Civil War scholarship that much. One of the main trends right now, which I think is independent of that, is efforts to, you might say, globalize or internationalize the history of the Civil War, to look at the impact of the Civil War on other nations, the impact of other nations on the Civil War, to compare what happened in the United States with other places that went through civil wars or processes of national consolidation in that period, to talk about the end of slavery in the United States in comparison with the end of slavery in other places. That's an interesting trend in scholarship. I don't think it has that much. I think the Civil War sesquicentennial was sort of a bust. I read an article somewhere, I think it was the Wall Street Journal, where in Virginia, shops, selling Civil War memorabilia they had stocked up for the sesquicentennial, and they didn't actually sell nearly as much as they thought they would. So, it wasn't. But nonetheless, the fact is that people are aware that the issues arising out of the Civil War about race in America are still, flashpoints of conflict in American society today. How would things have played out if Lincoln hadn't won the election? Maureen. Well, Maureen, who do you think would have won then? Is it Breckinridge who would have won, or Bell who would have won, or who was the other guy? Douglas who would have won? Well, you wouldn't have had a secession crisis. I think that's for sure. You would have probably had another 4 years of the same. But the Republican Party would have continued to grow. And I think having said 2 minutes ago that nothing is inevitable, I will now say the triumph of the Republican Party was probably inevitable at some point. If not 1860, 1864, 1868. The North was eclipsing the South in population. The North was eclipsing the South in economic development. And the Republican Party was uniting the North in a powerful political machine, so to speak. So the crisis was coming at some point. Maybe not 1860. It's certainly plausible to imagine a scenario where Lincoln did not win the election. So who would it have been? Douglas, I guess. He came in second in popular vote. Douglas would have been another Democratic president like Buchanan, Pierce. There'd been a whole load of them, Polk. But the crisis would have continued of the irrepressible conflict, as Seward called it. Did any abolitionists at the time attempt to effect change by focusing on the cotton trade? Yeah, that's a good question. There was an effort by abolitionists to promote what they called free labor cotton, to try to undercut the slave cotton economy by promoting the use of cotton grown by free farmers, free labor. But it didn't get that far. There wasn't a heck of a lot of that. The core of the cotton economy was the southern slave plantations. It was very hard to create an alternative or competing southern, you couldn't be growing cotton in the North. It had to be somewhere in the South. It was very hard to undercut the primacy of cotton in international trade at that time. But they did. They were trying to promote textiles using free labor cotton and all this. There was a movement in Britain to do the same thing. It didn't really get all that far. Did Jefferson Davis realize he was initiating war when he ordered the attack on Fort Sumter? Or did the South think Lincoln would not rise to the challenge? That's an interesting question, because many people debate, why did Lincoln send supplies to Fort Sumter? But fewer debate, why did Davis order the southern batteries there to fire on Fort Sumter? Yes, Davis knew he was starting a war. Absolutely. He was quite cognizant of that. I think one of his motives was to force the Upper South into the Confederacy. Virginia had not yet seceded. Tennessee, North Carolina, Arkansas had not yet seceded. Davis thought a conflict would force them to take sides. And they would take the side of the South. Now, when we say, and Lincoln, of course, understood he was risking war. In fact, more than that. Lincoln knew what had happened when when Buchanan sent the Star of the West, the ship, to reinforce Fort Sumter. The Southerners fired on it. Lincoln knew that. It was 2 months earlier, 3 months earlier. Lincoln knew they were going to fire on this. I mean, these guys knew what was going on. But nobody knew the war was coming that happened. They thought it would be a short war, a war with limited casualties, one big battle maybe. And that will be it. Nobody anticipated the war that actually took place for 4 years with horrendous loss of life and everything. So when you say, did Davis realize he was initiating war? Probably yes, but he didn't realize he was initiating the war that actually happened. He was initiating, he thought, a war like previous wars, the Mexican War, you know, a small scale war without the massive bloodshed that actually took place. Was abolition as great an issue in 1850 as 1860? Since the Fugitive Slave Act was one of the things that brought it to public consciousness. Would Fillmore or Pierce or Buchanan have performed the way Lincoln had? Well, we have two different questions there, actually. Go back up a little, okay? So I can see the, yes, well, the issue was not abolition per se. It was the westward expansion of slavery. And that was a much bigger issue in 1860 than it had been. In 1850, the status of slavery in every inch of the United States was settled, except for New Mexico and Arizona, where not a hell of a lot of people were moving out there at that time. The Missouri Compromise, state law, determined what the status of slavery was. But in the 1850s, as you know from the course, that changed. The Kansas-Nebraska Act seemed to open up the middle of the country to slavery. The Dred Scott decision said slavery can go anywhere in the territories. So the issue of slavery and the territories was a much more vital issue in the 1850s than it had been before, because before it was settled, at least as people understood. Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan, would they have acted the way Lincoln did? You know, I don't know. Would they have sent reinforcements to Fort Sumter? Well, actually, Buchanan did, right? What would Buchanan have done if they had fired on Fort Sumter? I don't think he would have called for troops the way Lincoln did, but he might have actually been forced to. The firing on Fort Sumter led to a tremendous upsurge of a kind of a war fever in the North. And it would have been hard for the president to control that. Now, Fillmore, Pierce, and Buchanan would certainly not have moved toward emancipation later on. They would have probably tried to compromise with the South in ways that Lincoln would not have. Lincoln won by winning the votes of the North. And, you know,
It's okay, just keep going.
is it still going? Sorry. Okay, our microphone here. That was what triggered the secession crisis. The election of Lincoln as a man committed to preventing the westward expansion of slavery. Southerners were not willing to accept that. They thought it was a danger to slavery itself. The attack on Harper's Ferry widened the gap between North and South, no question about that. But it was not the precipitant of the secession crisis or the Civil War. Are there any films about the Civil War Reconstruction you recommend in terms of historical accuracy? No. I'm not a big fan of Hollywood history, as I think I have said now and then in the course. You know, I'm a killjoy. People won't go to a movie with me. All I do is complain. It's not accurate. It's not accurate. This is wrong. This is inaccurate. That's not what Hollywood is supposed to do. It's entertaining. You want to have a nice time, go to a movie. You want to learn history, read a book. Maybe 12 Years a Slave. 12 Years a Slave is pretty good. The one that won the Academy Award a couple of years ago. But even 12 Years a Slave, which gives a very graphic and I think real depiction of slavery, is great man history. That's the problem with Hollywood history. It's great man history. It's Malcolm X, it's Gandhi, it's Lincoln, it's Solomon Northup in 12 Years a Slave. Hollywood, it seems the genre itself has to focus on the lone individual man. They don't do this for women. It's always the great man. That's not history. That's not how history operates. It homogenizes everything else. So you can learn things. It's entertaining, but it's not really history. And I have not. There's no film I would really recommend. I think 12 Years a Slave is pretty good for understanding some of the brutal realities of slavery. So I maybe give that a little recommendation. Why did Lincoln's election convince Southerners they must secede? Well, I guess we're talking about that. If you want to know, read South Carolina's Declaration of the Causes of Secession. December 1860, South Carolina votes to secede. They issue a declaration, just like the Patriots did in 1776. It's a statement of why we're doing this to the world. What do they talk about? They talk about specific abuses, like the North doesn't want to return fugitive slaves. But what they really are concerned about is Northern public opinion. Northerners have turned against slavery. Northerners have taken it upon themselves to judge the morality of the institutions of the South. And now Northerners have elected a president. We cannot live under that circumstance. They say very specifically, the future of slavery is not safe. They don't think Lincoln's going to abolish slavery. They can't. The president can't do that. But nonetheless, they think this is putting the country on a road which will lead to the gradual decline and elimination of slavery. Lincoln's election is seen as a fundamental shift of national power. Southerners have pretty much controlled the federal government from the beginning. Now, Northerners take control of the federal government, and they're not willing to accept that. How similar was the structure and function of the Confederate Constitution and the federal government to that of the Union? In the next MOOC, I will talk, when we get to the Confederacy, about their Constitution. Yes, the Confederate Constitution was modeled on the U.S. Constitution with a few key changes. Some of them are rather interesting. For example, the Confederacy gave representation in Congress to Native American tribes. The U.S. Constitution doesn't do that. Tribes that sided with the Confederacy would get a seat in Congress. Interesting. The Confederate Constitution makes the president, gives the president a 6-year term, and he can't be reelected, which makes him a lame duck as soon as he's elected. It was a kind of crazy thing to do, but that's different. The main difference is that the Confederate Constitution explicitly mentions slavery. The federal Constitution did not use the word slavery, explicitly protects slavery. No state in the Confederacy can abolish slavery. All territories under the Confederacy would have slavery. In other words, it makes the federal government explicitly a defender of slavery, which in the U.S. Constitution is all murky and debatable and vague, and people are still debating what was the relationship of the federal Constitution to slavery. But the Confederate relation was very clear. It was explicitly a pro-slavery constitution, and I think it limited citizenship to white people. I think it also said no black person, even free, can be a citizen of the Confederacy. How did Lincoln's life accord with the ideology of free soil, free labor, free men of the Republican Party? Mary, TA, hi Mary, an excellent young up-and-coming historian. Lincoln believed that his life exemplified what I called long ago in a book, the free labor ideology, which he thought was characteristic of the North and was the basic difference between freedom and slavery. In freedom, the ordinary person, and Lincoln certainly began as an ordinary person, very humble background, grew up on a poor farm, but that society offers you the opportunity to rise in the social scale through your own hard work. That's what Lincoln believed. And of course, slavery denies that to people. Lincoln worked hard, educated himself, and rose in the social scale. Now, it is also true he married a rich woman. That didn't hurt. That's not part of the free labor ideology, but that's one of the things Lincoln did that got him going forward. But still, he worked hard and he rose. And he often said in his campaign speeches in the 1850s, I am an example of the opportunity that Northern society offers to ordinary people. So he felt there was a congruence between his values and his experience of the values of Northern society and of the Republican Party, which now, that relates exactly to keeping slavery out of the Western territories. Because Lincoln and many others believed if you let slavery spread out there, it will cut off social mobility for ordinary Northern people, white Northerners. Because moving west is part of how you get ahead at that time. But if slavery goes into Kansas, free Northern farmers are not going to go into Kansas. It'll cut them off. And so the spread of slavery is actually a threat to Northerners and their future prospects. Lincoln articulated this idea very powerfully in his speeches in the 1850s. Now, by this time, the free labor ideology was already getting out of date. Certainly in the East, in the industrializing areas like Massachusetts, in the big cities like New York and Philadelphia, the opportunity of mobility was shrinking. You had a permanent wage earning class, often immigrants, Irish and others. The opportunity to get out of that status and become an independent property owner, as Lincoln, talked about, was declining there. But in Lincoln's America, in Illinois, I think his vision had great plausibility still. Most people in Illinois were still small farmers, artisans. There weren't a lot of big factories, a few in Chicago, but mostly not. The world Lincoln grew up in was the world of the free labor ideology, and his own life exemplified them according to his outlook. I have heard many various views on the flag. I assume you mean the Confederate flag, right? And I would like to know how many different flags represented slavery. There's the war flag, the American flag, other flags. How can a flag be considered racist? A flag's a flag, yeah, that's for sure. But since as Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy from Georgia, said in his famous cornerstone speech in the spring of 1861, slavery and indeed black inferiority is the cornerstone of the Confederacy. Therefore, it's not unreasonable to see the Confederate flag as a symbol of slavery. I know there are many people in this country who display the Confederate flag. They have little decals, stickers on their, car or pickup truck or motorcycle or something. And if you ask them, well, doesn't that represent slavery? They're going to say, no, this has nothing to do with slavery. This is about sort of rebellion or something like that. But there are many people, including me, who see the Confederate flag as a symbol of slavery, especially when it is flown officially by a governmental institution. For example, it's only a few months ago because of a tragedy in Charleston that the flag was taken down at the State House, on the grounds of the State House in South Carolina. Now, that's a governmental spot. That government is supposed to represent all the people of South Carolina, and yet they're flying a flag that explicitly only represents the white people. The black people had no stake in the Confederacy or the Confederate flag. Or universities. University of Mississippi has taken down the Confederate flag, which is flying all over the place down there. Why? Because the chancellor there said, hey, we want to be welcoming to everybody. We want the atmosphere on this campus to make every student comfortable. And that flag is seen by many of our students as a symbol of slavery. So, there was the Confederate flag and then the Confederate battle flag, which is different, which is really what's usually flown with the stars and bars. And it should be in a museum. It's part of our history. It should be there for people to see, but I don't think the flying of it, particularly in any official capacity, is a desirable thing nowadays. We're running toward the end, but we'll take a couple more questions. If there were states to prohibit Black people from entering certain states, were they allowed if they entered as slaves when they accompanied their own? Well, interesting question. Here's the point. There were northern states that by law prohibited Black people from entering the state, including Illinois, where Lincoln came from, Indiana, Oregon. I believe actually Missouri also had that. Now, they're not talking about slaves. They're talking about free Black people. They did not want a free population of Black people. And they just said, no Blacks in this state. Now, those, not Missouri, which is a slave state, but those other states that I mentioned, Illinois, by the 1850s, it was not legal for an owner to bring a slave into those states. Those are free states. There is no slavery in those states. You cannot bring a slave legally into that state. If a slave is brought in, he or she becomes free automatically. Not a fugitive slave running away, someone brought voluntarily by their owner. So that's a different question. Free Blacks were barred from several states. That's absolutely true. Racism was quite prevalent in the North as well as the South. We should never forget that. But that's what we have 2 more minutes, so let's take one more question, maybe 2 more, and we'll stop. I recently read Isabel Wilkerson's book, The Warmth of Other Suns, The Great Migration from the South in the 20th Century, the greatest untold story. If our premise is true, why was the story never told? I know Isabel Wilkerson. I think it's an excellent book. Isabel is a good writer. Isabel has a healthy sense of self-promotion, as writers should have. It is not an untold story. It was told. It's been told by many people. She told it very well. I'm not criticizing her book. It's an excellent, but it wasn't untold. There are plenty of books about the Great Migration of African Americans from South to North in the 20th century. But her publisher probably told her, you've got to stake a claim to originality here. And there is a lot original in the book. So I give her a pass on that. Everybody wants what they write to be new and untold. That's how you sell a few copies. So I don't blame her. All right, one more question. Let's see what it is. President Foner mentions Buchanan as one of the worst presidents of all. Is Buchanan worse than Nixon? You know, there's a lot of competition for the title of the worst president in American history. It's a big group competing there. My personal candidate is actually Andrew Johnson, who came after Lincoln. If you want to know why, come for the 3rd course and you'll find out my view of Andrew Johnson. Buchanan was pretty bad also. Maybe they're both kind of obscured by Lincoln. You have the guy before Lincoln and the guy after Lincoln, both considered terrible presidents. Maybe it's the shadow of Lincoln on them. Nixon, yeah, you can vote for him. George W. Bush, I think, is a candidate, but that's that's a political issue, nothing to do with the Civil War. So, historians have this game where we rank the presidents every once in a while, and all those people I mentioned end up toward the bottom, and it just varies from year to year which one is top of the heap or bottom of the heap as the worst president. But certainly, I think Andrew Johnson, he's my candidate right now. All right, listen, it's 8 o'clock, folks. Thank you all for taking part in the Google Hangout. I hope you have enjoyed the MOOC. I hope you do the final exercises for the course, and I hope to see you in January and then later on in the spring in the sequels. Star Wars 2, 3, and 4 coming out of this MOOC. So the Civil War itself and then the Reconstruction era, both pivotal crises in American history. So thank you tonight for taking part.